Happy New Year to everyone out there. We're back from 2024 into 2025 here on ShiftED podcast. Today we do resolutions a lot, right? At the start of our 2025, at start a new year. Okay, we're gonna try this. Well, I have an amazing guest here today that's going to kind of help us navigate the brain and how it functions around mental health and well-being. I have Dr. Tina Montreuil from McGill University. Now, Tina, you are an associated director for counseling psychology, the applied psychology, and also director of childhood anxiety and regulation of emotions laboratory, which is CARE, right?
Yes, it's summed up for CARE. So we have various projects or interests in our lab, but they tend to focus around, better understanding child internalizing disorders, of which anxiety is one of them. And, part of our research is to demonstrate how closely emotion regulation is associated with anxiety. And our focus is, yes, establishing those associations, but more importantly, trying to determine ways, understanding the mechanisms by which they are associated so that we can actually help kids, manage anxiety better and sort of not suffer in silence. And I think that's one of the things why, for me, I'm an expert of course, child conduct disorders as well, right, which are more externalizing. But in my experience is that, children who are anxious, a lot of the times they will not perturb the class, they will not disturb the class, but they are still very much experiencing psychological and emotional distress. And that's why, as a researcher, guided by clinical interest, I've decided to focus mainly on those internalizing disorders, of which anxiety.
Oh, yeah. Well, the brain's such a complicated thing, right? And emotions and all that, and we'll dive into that. But I'm so curious, how did you come to this spot in life? What were some of your moments in your timeline that kind of brought you to where you are now at McGill?
Yeah. So, in preparation for this podcast, I was kind of thinking about that. But I also had a colleague who we were talking about history very recently, another podcast, and it got me to also think about, how far does it go back? And so, as far as I can remember, I am the eldest of three girls, and we were very sort of close, tight-knit community because I grew up in a small town. And so as far as I can remember, I have very strong recollections of just being the teacher. So being in an educational setting. So it seems to be something that I've always, that I've taken a liking to from a very early age. And I guess just like anybody, I grew up and you're kind of trying to figure out what you want to do. I think the sort of pedagogical or teaching aspect of who I am today has sort of intersected with, obviously, a person who I have also a lot of experiences in schools or what have you. I was always someone drawn to helping people. I don't know what it is. I feel like I have this sort of attunement to other people. There's a way in me when I look at people, I look at their behavior, I look at their emotional expression. I tend to focus on that, and I'm really interested in understanding what's going on beyond what you see. And that I have memories of that from early on as well. So I guess the crossroad is, loving the aspect of teaching and sort of transferring knowledge, supporting coaching, I guess, and then combining that with a desire to help others feel better. Kind of brought me to who I am today. So it's kind of coming full circle. It's not like I planned this out, but it's kind of how it happened. And then I've gotten great opportunities. You never become who you are on your own being. It starts from your home. Of course, I'm very fortunate to have grown up in a home where people believed in me and pushed me to succeed. But also, how I came to work in schools, because I'm not a local Montrealer, was coming to McGill and studying psychology there, and then coming across this great program, which I believe still exists, but in a different location, but the Taylor Adolescent Program. And so that program really, was training psychology students mainly to work as sort of clinical tutors. So they were matching you with students and finding you a sort of, I guess, an internship. So you were basically combining it with a student, and you got to work with various schools, and through these connections got to eventually even work in schools. So I've worked for the English Montreal School Board. I've worked for the Lester Pearson School Board, mainly the Anglo sector. And I pretty much have had every single position you can imagine. I've been a shadow. I've been a teacher's assistant. I've been a sort of like childcare worker. So that was during my studies. So working in schools during my master's added a lot of contextual knowledge to my studies, because that's what I was studying, inclusive education and, sort of curriculum adaptation as part of being a psychologist and school psychologist. But it also, contributed financially to my path. And so this is kind of what brings me now, working in what I'm doing. And I just so happen now to be a professor at McGill, but be a professor at McGill in the Faculty of Education. And that's probably my biggest surprise in life. It's really great. I love what I'm doing, but I can't say that I actually saw that long term. I never sort of thought I'd be eventually a professor, but I knew I would be helping people. And so it's great because now really, if you look at my early beginnings, it's basically, brought me here, like being able to teach and as part of my capacity and my role as an associate professor, but also teach what I love to do, which is psychology and helping people. So it's like really an amazing job. Really, it's like it really feels like it's something that I love doing because it goes way back.
Yeah, it's cool. I see the circular path as well. Really cool. Well, it kind of brings me to, this podcast kind of got started out of COVID, out of the pandemic, and trying to keep teachers in touch and kind of having conversations with our local people and stuff like that. And I wanted to ask you about, kind of start with the pandemic, because it did play a big role, and I think it still continues. What do you think the biggest challenges are for schools and teachers and students, if we put our minds in that realm, following the pandemic? Like, how's our well-being going on in schools nowadays? We're maybe 4 years ish removed. What have you noticed in your observations?
Yeah. So first, I always try to not have an overly catastrophizing or pessimistic view of things, right? So I think it's factual. The pandemic affected everybody, changed. I guess it kind of left its mark. It created something that none of us, I think, maybe some of us that are more pessimistic in nature, but I think for most of us, we were taken aback because none of us could have imagined that we'd ever be placed in such a situation and that it would play out the way it did. When you think about, we were talking about the brain before, like every single fight or flight fiber of our body got activated during this period, right? Let's say from biological, physiological fears of contamination all the way to our lives completely changing, our homes becoming where our places of rest for most of us now becoming associated as a place of work. So when I say all fibers of our body, both physiological, the fear of contamination, but also like our well-being mentally got affected by this one single commonly experienced event. So I think without being pessimistic or catastrophizing, I think we're just speaking facts. So that's kind of where I go from. And then the other thing is that, the thing is that, we already our lifestyle, like your families and parents, like I was telling you before, like it's kind of impossible to talk about child well-being without also addressing the systemic aspect, which is the family, the closest microsystem to these individuals. But the thing is that, a lot of us, like, having worked in school, like even like 10, 12 years ago, we were seeing, some families were both extremes of the continuum. Some families, very low SES, low education, perhaps kids were coming to school with some, precarious conditions. But also the other extreme is like the families that are overly, are working a lot, traveling a lot. So it's not that they don't have the means to attend to their kids, but they're just busy. And so the school provided this basis of ensuring that, we're training, we're forming future citizens, right? So it's almost like this, as if the school was compensating for some of the things that maybe at home under certain conditions were more precarious, right?
Yeah.
What ended up happening is that because of the pandemic, I think one thing that it caused is that it destabilized sort of the middle, the people that were probably more stable, that the schools did not have to then compensate for. So therefore, now the minority became a larger, I wouldn't say majority, but it became a larger proportion. More of the kids that were before more stable in the middle, even good families, all of a sudden the conditions of surrounding the pandemic impacted these families and therefore also impacted the children. Therefore, there was a greater, so it's kind of like, like think about it as a faucet. There's a small wave. Okay, the school are feeling the pressure in terms of what's happening. But then all of a sudden, turn on the tap much larger debit. All of a sudden, it's like the wave is a bit bigger. We have a lot more demands coming in. The other aspect of that is that when I was talking about the school, the role of the teachers, that's why for me, I oftentimes interchangeably talk about the parents as agents of socializations for children, but teachers as well. Like our kids in elementary school, preschool, they spend 8, sometimes even like more hours per day in school. So the influence of the teacher is ginormous. It's very important. And so therefore, in a certain sense, like the teachers are also agents of socialization. So therefore, that's what I mean by the school was compensating. If you have maybe some kids came from harsh homes where there was harsh parenting, but they came to school and the teacher was supportive, the teacher was encouraging, the teacher built their self-esteem. That was great. But another dimension is that now we have more demands from the families, and now we have people in schools that over time, because this lasted for a while, became tired. We're talking about COVID compassion fatigue. Right. And the reality is that, these people, the school staff, these amazing people became very tired, and it never really stopped for them. And I think, even, I'm not teaching in elementary or high school, teaching in a university setting, but I think for most of us, we're seeing our staff, people are tired, and we haven't really stopped. So then it brings me to then putting these two things together. We have a lot more children coming in with emotional issues, systemic issues. And then we have staff that, they chose this vocation, this job, not because they're being paid excessively well, but because they have the care, the love of teaching and the love of working with children. So there's still good people there. Those qualities are still there, but you're tired, right, or you're deprived yourself. And a lot of the families I was telling you about, some of the teachers, they were the ones impacted with these sort of like systemic, having to take care of aging families, maybe having lost some families to COVID. And then yet you still are called upon going back into the schools and supporting others. And I think it's a combination of the two that now allows me to answer your question, hopefully as well as I can, is that this is what's happening now in the schools, is that COVID has come and gone, but the aftermath, it's still there. Right. And, like people might argue, well, the teachers, they have summers to rest. Well, I think, any clinical psychologist will tell you that the accumulated fatigue that a lot of these teachers have endured would require more than just a summer. Right. It's not enough. And so therefore, I think this is to me what I see. And this is what explains, for example, that, the schools are still feeling some of the aftermath. And there's, we still have some great teachers, but I think we still have to think, from the ministry's perspective, from parents and the expectations of the teachers as well, that are teaching their kids, is that, yes, COVID is done. But, these folks, these givers, these caregivers, by extension, have endured a lot. Sure. And they haven't had, perhaps, I think, enough time to really recover fully from COVID.
Yeah, I see that too, where there was never closure. You just had to keep, churning the mill, and hoping that you don't burn out or, yes. And we're seeing that in how many teachers are coming in to become teachers, pre-service teachers, and the duration of their careers tend to be a little bit shorter and shorter as as time goes on. I totally love that idea too. I don't love the idea, but I'm like the awareness of that they haven't stopped and that they are tired. You can see that a lot of the time, but that love for teaching and that sense of responsibility and duty. I mean, teachers are amazing, strong people that, they
Absolutely.
put their heads down, they just go. Um, I wanted to ask you too, kind of around that is this kind of like anxiety and mental well-being something that kids learn from parents, teachers, others, or is it part of them? Did they have that in them already, and it takes somebody to activate it? But can you dive into that a little bit of how do kids become anxious and have difficulty sometimes with their mental health?
Yeah. So, just like, if you take the model of the developmental origins of disease, we have something similar now as well with mental health, is that, of course, like anything, we're born with our own temperament. Each child has its own temperament, and temperament is largely genetically sort of wired, right? Like, so of course, I think it's not impossible that you have two parents that there's no history of let's take anxiety specifically, and then could that result in a child being anxious? Yes, but again, it's all about the incidence, right? So it's never like causal direct cause, but it's the likelihood of, or the increased risk of, right?
Right.
So usually what we do see is that minimally there's, on one side of the parents, the genetic biological parents, there is a lineage of either, it doesn't need to be anxiety specifically. It could be anxiety, could be
Sure.
depression, it could be anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something where there was either suspected. So that's why we often have to ask, not just like diagnosed, but sometimes people live their entire life without an actual diagnosis. But like people will say, oh yeah, like whenever there was an incident, my mom was a worrier. She was like, she would be preoccupied. It was evident, she would stress out when people come over, these types of things. So typically that's what we have. So there's something, a genetic component. And you sort of talked about that before, about like, that there's like almost like a stress vulnerability model. So you have a genetic predisposition, and then, you need an environment, something to basically trigger the genetic predisposition to be sort of like manifested, or we call it about phenotype. So you have it activates the manifestation related to the genetic presentation. So it's usually a combination of both. So that, at the same time, I'm always careful how I address it, because I never talk about, I don't want parents to say, oh, it's the parent's fault. We do that. It's the parent's fault if you're anxious. That could be true. Like you might grow up in an environment where it kind of was more stressful, and therefore it did lead to you developing some vulnerability when it comes to anxiety. But the good side of that as well is that because the environment plays a role in sort of like setting up or turning on your genetic vulnerability, is that if you learn the tools, your environment can also become one to buffer this risk, right? So you may be born into a family where, your parents were anxious, and the way they reacted. That's why I say, working with kids, you have to work with parents as well, because our response to our kids will play a role in how they express their emotions. That we call that emotion regulation, socialization behaviors, because it sort of sets the tone. It's not exclusive, it's not causal, but it's one of the mechanisms by which it gets manifested. But so the positive take I want to tell people as well is that's why, it's worth it for families to learn more about emotion regulation and how to promote it in their children. It's worth it for schools and teachers to learn about it, because, there's ways that we can change it. And the earlier, the better, because when we're younger, our brain is like there's brain plasticity. So that means the brain is malleable. It has the ability to reorganize itself more in a more easier, more feasible fashion. Hence the whole aspect of my lab that studies and promotes like school-based mental health, which is, let's give the kids the tools before they become ill, so that when they do, perhaps by implementing these strategies, they can either offset or at least reduce the severity of what is being manifested. So it's twofold. I think I always want to be careful in not having that dialogue without also highlighting that, you know what, maybe you did grow up in an environment where it was anxiety prone or induced, but you have the ability via the environment to also how I could say not, reverse things, reverse the negative side effects. And also if that's why I'm working in pregnancy now, is that if we teach parents even before they start thinking about these realities, is that hopefully by the time their children grow, these positive, proactive changes can be implemented in the system, in the environment, to then sort of create better outcomes.
Right. Well, and I think too, like kind of going back to the pandemic, that environment, I think projected mental well-being much more to the forefront because we were seeing it much more often in our teachers, parent, like everyone was affected by it, as we said before. With that in mind, what are some tips or tricks here to start this school year off that you would recommend for teachers and parents to be aware of or to support that mental health in the students and in their kids?
Yeah. I would say one of the first thing is probably surrounding just organization and the level of activity that is in your family. I think this is one of the things that I'm trying to always, even myself, like I'm speaking as a professional, but I'm also a mom. I have a family, right? So, and I'm always conscientious of not providing, advice that I don't myself, implement. That's just my way that I want to live my life by. But point being is that definitely there's a systemic pressure to always be doing something. The sort of like positive irony of the pandemic is that, despite the fact that people were stressed about like sanitary issues and, the health component, because a lot of the things closed and were interrupted, the reality is that a lot of people reported that they were actually feeling healthier after a few months, because they were forced into making a choice, a systemic choice, and some activities were reduced. And therefore, you weren't overworking yourself as an individual, but also as a family. You didn't have to rush after school to bring your kids to this activity or that activity every single day. That was not there. So you kind of went about your day of like, okay, you know what? Today, I think I would like to do this. And then let's just do it. So, and I actually, one of the sort of caution, like I remember towards the end of the pandemic, people were like, okay, so what's a cautionary tale that you envision as we're exiting, as we're walking away, seeing the end of the tunnel out of the pandemic? Was this very point, was that people forget quickly. As much as now, if I ask most people, either that I saw clinically or that I was doing a lot of sort of talks at the time and sort of conference, people were saying, I'm so glad that I'm doing things maybe more intuitively, because I'm kind of forced to, but I'm prioritizing my mental health. I'm prioritizing my health. I'm walking every day. And I was like, well, just remember this, because once the system is not forcing you into reducing the over demand on your lifestyle, you have to remember the benefits of it so that you maintain it. But I said, I feel like for a lot of people, they're going to go right back to where they were and forget the benefits of making these choices. So I think we're afraid as families, we compare ourselves a lot to what other kids are doing, what other parents are supporting their kids in achieving. And we're really filling up our activity, our schedule, and that has an impact. So therefore, you can have the best strategies in the world to manage anxiety, but anxiety, at the base is the result of stress that is not well managed. And, so your schedule being overwhelmed and too full, I think is one of the ways that I see families struggle, is that we do too much and there's not enough time in one day or one week to feasibly, a lot of the times, be able to do everything that we do sustainably. Maybe right now it's working, but eventually you're going to burn out. But that's the reality. So I think, that's one of the things we have to do first and foremost. Think about prioritizing and trying to, establish. I was talking about that during the pandemic. Like, what's your family plan? Like, your family is, we do that as part of parenting care. We always say, like, in case of emergency, what's your plan? And do it based on your values. And I think the more we can try to focus our outlook on not what the society is doing, not what other people are, because there's always, like Instagram versus reality. Like there's these families that seemingly, even in the media sometimes, we talk about that a lot in pregnancy. Now, this is like what post-pregnancy looks like mom, like hair all well done, like makeup on, like nice clothes, like lost all the baby weight. And then the reality, this is not what most women are experiencing. So I think we have to try to establish what does our family need? And it may be less than others, but maybe it's healthy for us. And so even with schools, maybe this teacher is able to do all that. I talk about that. I compare it to gardens. You're looking at your fellow teacher, and they seem like they're doing this and that. And oh my gosh, so it looks so great what they're doing. And you're trying really hard to have that fruit garden. But maybe you're like a vegetable garden, to give an analogy. Right. And then ultimately, like, I comparing myself, I'm like, I'm just a vegetable garden. Like, I wish I was a fruit garden. But ultimately, when you think about it, like, if I had to choose one over the other, like, I shouldn't have to choose, because I need the fruits. I need the output of that individual, but I also need the vegetables. So all of us have something to contribute. And this is why I think I always bring it back to my other point about anxiety is social support, community. Like, during the pandemic, we lost that. So all of a sudden, because we lost it, we valued it. Now that we have it, how many of us now, when we look at the pandemic, we're like, oh, if only I could go see my mother, if only I could connect with that neighbor. And now we have the ability to do it. How many of us are actually doing it? Yes. Right? We always sort of value something once we don't have it. We try to have a mindset of more taking advantage of it now that we have it. So that starts with priority. So the social support, like, back to my thing about, like, how can I benefit? One teacher has vegetables, like, it's figurative, right? But one has fruits. Well, we need to be in community to be able to benefit from each other's output. And so therefore, I'm seeing that, we're going back to being very individualistic, very sort of doing our own thing. But ultimately, that has a price as well, because we can't benefit from each other's gifts and contributions and skills and aptitudes, right? So there's very little benefits to trying to be someone else. Instead, let's fully assume who we are and try to, in community, collectivity, try to benefit or also capitalize on what others have to offer in order to be able to just be more happy, but also to be less tired. It goes back to my initial point, like being overworked. What is there a way that we can set up our work and our school environments where maybe we can't have two teachers in one class? The co-teaching model is not endorsed by the ministry like it is perhaps in other countries or other schools. But is there a way that we can share, I don't know, lesson preparation? I'm good at Univers Social, so sort of history, and you're good in math. I'm really struggling when I have to do my math. So instead of like not telling anybody that I'm struggling with putting together my math, lesson, can I just be comfortable with who I am, share, what I have to give, and then maybe benefit from other people helping me out with what they've prepared. And then all of a sudden I can go home earlier on a given day because I've been able to, complete my course preparation or my class preparation more efficiently, trying to be someone else that I'm not, right? And I know it's very philosophical what I'm saying, but I think we still have to think about that, because that's how we were living in the pandemic. Right. And that was the positive of the pandemic. But now that we're out of the pandemic, we've kind of lost these lessons. We've lost these kinds of, let's say, so these life, like life skills or things that would benefit us ultimately.
Yeah. I love how too there were so many important lessons that we learned from that period of time that we all went through together. And I love the idea of reflecting back on it, for the positive things that came out of it,
Yes.
where the rat race wasn't always going on. Like we had to, shelter in place sometimes. We had curfews, and we often forget those lessons. It was just like almost like we wanted to forget about it and re-assume the way we were before, without acknowledging that it did change us, and that we did learn some insightful lessons, as you're pointing out. I love it.
Well, let's not wait till it's forced upon us, right?
Right.
Because that's what
Exactly.
burnout does as well. I'll talk about the other thing. Ultimately, like doing everything or trying to do everything comes at a cost.
Right. Yes.
And so therefore, the cost of that is burnout,
Yeah.
right? Or like being psychologically ill. And so that's what our body's way of saying my brain is shutting down because it's just too much. And then it can lead into even like my brain's over tiredness can also lead my body physiologically to shut down. That's what a burnout is. It's just a psychological and a physiological like let down. I shut down. I'm just overly tired. And there, like once we hit rock bottom, like we have to stop. So I always tell people like, what's better to make conscious choice today to sort of like slow things down, which will help me manage stress better, which ultimately it's all mathematical. If I manage stress better, I'm going to be less anxious. Or
Yeah.
wait till again, not a pandemic this time, but a burnout actually slows down. But the problem is that once you hit rock bottom like that, the bottom of the barrel with a burnout, can take years to really remit from that or get better from that. So I think we always think about what it could be. Oh, here's what I could be like. If it's never good enough. We're never good enough. But I think we also have to learn to value where we're at today based on what it could be. So think about the negative as well and sort of use that as a leverage of, okay, so maybe I need to make these decisions today to ensure that I continue living my life in a more sustainable way, in a happier way as well. Like happiness it's not a formula, it's not money, it's perspective, right? It's based on values, it's based on a sense that I'm making decision. I have a sense of agency as opposed to just running on autopilot, right?
Right. In control rather than
Exactly.
the world just at, I'm at the will of the
I'm
world.
just kind of like a bouncing ball, like
Right.
whatever around me is what, but it doesn't need to be this way. And so this is why I always say I could come up with the best strategies, but it's almost like putting a band-aid on an infected wound, right? Ultimately, these strategies can only really work well if systemically, I'm at a place where things are healthy and sustainable, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We
So
could take a time
insightful,
off.
really insightful. I mean, I think just listening and having this conversation, it's starting to trigger ideas in me, and reflecting, and like it's really interesting to kind of look at yourself in the mirror a little bit, and be like, this is who I am, and maybe I need to adjust this or tweak that, or go and see the neighbor, or whatever it might be that's going to be your thing. But I love this idea that we can control it. We don't have to be that kind of bouncing ball, as you said.
Exactly. And also let's control it now because eventually we're not infallible. And so therefore other things, maybe not a pandemic this time, but other life circumstances could, we don't know, like, things happen. Life is ups and downs, right? So let's not wait till something on the outside of us stops us. And how about we just try to make some choices today that will not at all costs prevent harmful things or sad things from happening, but at least it's paving the way into creating a more stable, that's what emotion regulation is as well, right? It's like my ability to tolerate the distress, potential for distress that comes from adversity, right? Like emotion regulation is not measured when all things are going well. What differentiates people that are well regulated from those that are not, it's when they're tested, right? When periods of adversity. For some reason, people that have better emotion regulated, like when they experience adversity, they don't deal with it in the same way. And I think we know from research that it's really based on their outlook. It's based on, for example, if I have less things going on left and right, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, I break my leg, for example. Well, then, the less things I have, if my life was already more manageable before that life event, well, then, I'll be better able to just kind of like address various needs. If I'm running on, like, almost like paycheck to paycheck, that kind of analogy, like if I'm running on like a thin thread, if I'm like spread left and right, and then an event like that happens, for sure it's going to create a much more overwhelming reaction, because I was already overwhelmed before that event, and now that event is occurring, well, then I can't address all the different things, right? So it's also the perspective. It's like, okay, maybe this bad thing happened, but you know what, I also have these things, right? So this idea of compartmentalizing our life like that, and making sure that it's feasible. If something were to happen, it's all the notion, if something were to happen, like, would I still be able to manage all of that? And I'm the worst at that as well. We know a lot of perfectionists are the worst at that, because we want to be doing everything everywhere.
Right.
But like, I'm reminded of that as I'm telling it to you as well. It is the way to do it. And that's why people, and if we study people that are naturally more resilient and emotionally regulated, they're not better individuals necessarily genetically than us. It's just they often have these systemic features that can be replicated by those that are less emotionally regulated. This is the characteristics around their lives typically. So it's not just genetics. It's like, this is how they tend to see life. This is how they tend to make the choices. This is our, based on values. And then, so therefore, if that's what they do and they seem to be better regulated, the idea is that, well, if I sort of make these same, or implement or introduce these same things in my everyday life, then essentially I should be able to see those same types of benefits. So I think the model by which I idea of resiliency is that it's not one that you're just born with. It's one that you can actually, in your environment, in your systemic, in your systems that you live by, whether it's professional or personal, it's one that can be harvested. And that's really my mindset. That's my view of things. I think it's way more encouraging and hopeful. So
really
you can
taps into that growth mindset idea, right?
Yes,
Like,
it's a
where
growth
you're not
mindset.
limited. You can always improve. You can always try something else. You can always practice a bit more. Like, it's not like, nope, this is
Test
who I
and see.
am.
Yes, it's like test it, try it, and see, and
Yeah.
you become the judge of it, right? But a lot of the times we don't even stop. That's why, again, another tool for emotion regulation and anti-anxiety is mindfulness. We need to be able, like everything I just said, to achieve, for example, making better choices, prioritizing, for example, socializing, valuing the sense of community. Well, you can only achieve that if you actually stop and think about how you're living your life, right? Mindfulness is that. It's just being attuned to what I'm thinking, what I'm doing. So that's another thing. If your life is busy, 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 full, well, you won't be able to be mindful, right? Because it's too full, it's too busy. So that's why, the idea of like prioritizing goes hand in hand with being more mindful, and being more mindful that you can be more attuned to your values. And then it's like once you trigger one thing, it's kind of like, I always give people the analogy, like, imagine you're riding your bike. You don't have a gear bike, you have a old style bike. You're pedaling forward, and then all of a sudden you want to start pedaling backwards. At first it's hard, like, to kind of get it to engage in the opposite direction. But eventually, once you do it, like, it's becoming much more, it's facilitated, right? It's the same thing. Like usually the first big change is the hardest. The mindset, perhaps. Yeah. The belief that, it can actually make a difference. Just that your level of conviction of like, oh, well, like just this little change will not make much of a difference. But what if it did? How about you test, you implement it, and you test and see and observe. And then usually, like, when you do that, like, then the next thing, it just kind of naturally falls through. Yeah. The hardest part is just the initiating the change. And that usually, after you do that, it's much easier to implement more changes to have a healthier lifestyle.
Yeah. So cool. Well, Tina, this has just been fascinating. Like, I want to have you back, because there's so much more that I have all these questions and notes that we didn't get to. So we'll definitely have to have a continuation of this chat. I think you've made us all much smarter today, and what a great episode to begin 2025 with. Just a little surge of think about things a bit. Think about you. Think about, your likes, dislikes, where you want to be. Maybe you're doing too much. Reduce down a bit. Like all these just wonderful thoughts that I think that we should be having at the beginning of a year. So thank you so much for all of your insight and strategies that you shared with us today. It was so cool.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for your invitation.
Cool. And I wish you all the best in 2025. And well, we'll be talking soon.
Thank you. Right back at you.